Good evening, everyone. Welcome, whether you're in the United States, here in Barbados, or elsewhere in the Caribbean. So happy to have you join us this evening for our Caribbean American Heritage Month lecture series. And for this night's topic, the road to emancipation, exploring the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor. I'm Larry Socha. I'm the Public Affairs Officer here at the U.S. Embassy in Bridgetown, Barbados. And we are so glad to have experts from both Barbados and the United States join us. Warm, wonderful, insightful scholars who I really think you're going to enjoy hearing from this evening. Please do make the chat tonight interactive. All of you are joining us on our Facebook platform. Thank you for being here. Please do type your comments or your questions into the comments section below the screen that you see in front of you. We'd love to hear from you, love to hear your reflections on the topics tonight and the questions that you have for our scholars. There's so much to discuss tonight. And before we get started, I do want to jump ahead to next week, Thursday, June 24th at 12 o'clock noon. We will have our final program of our Caribbean American Heritage Month, the role of youth in social activism and democratic participation. And this is with Sir Hilary Beckles, the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, and Dr. Zizwe Poe of Lincoln University, just outside Philadelphia. But turning to tonight, I want to introduce our moderator, Kevin Farmer. Kevin Farmer is currently the Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. He has lectured in archaeology in the Department of History at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and in the MA Heritage Studies program at UWI Cave Hill, Barbados. He's one of the embassy's best friends. So happy to have him here tonight. I made a comment last week that he was one of my favorite people in Barbados and got a bunch of text messages afterwards. There was a lot of jealousy. But Kevin, thank you for being here tonight. So excited to hear from you and leading the discussion of the road to emancipation, exploring the Gullah Geechee Heritage Corridor. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Larry. And thank you, U.S. Embassy, for sponsoring what is going to be a fantastic night's event. Let me introduce our panelists for tonight. Ms. Rhoda Green. Rhoda Green worked as a court reporter for 28 years in Charleston County, South Carolina, and was a member of the National Association of Court Reporters. In 1987, she obtained what for her was a life-changing book entitled The Barbados-Carolina Connection, co-authored by Dr. Henry Fraser, now Sir Henry, and Mr. Warren and the late Warren Allen. This raised an unlikely passion in Rhoda. It captivated an interest and imagination as a native Barbadian and a current, should I say, Charlestonian resident, of that connection on the untapped and at that time unknown connections between Charleston and Barbados that Rhoda has spent the rest of her life's work bringing to the fore and reminding everyone, when you talk Charleston, you talk Barbados. Realizing the role Barbados played in the Carolina settlement led her to further research and, I dare say, activism that is necessary when one seeks to engage others who don't always know their history about what is important about it. She became associated with several historical groups and organized a lot of history, heritage, and culture research connections between the two. She served and revived at the time the now defunct Carolina Caribbean Association for many years. She's been the recipient of many awards and acknowledgements for her community work in highlighting those connections. I dare say that the Barbados government's involvement in the promotion of that Carolina's Barbados connection would not have been possible without Rhoda. For that, she was awarded a Silver Crown of Merit, and in 2008, she became Barbados's honorary consul to South Carolina. In 2012, the Barbados and Carolinas Legacy Foundation was registered and certified as a nonprofit corporation in South Carolina. Green is the founder and CEO up to today. As a past president of the Friends of Charleston Landing, the South Carolina State Park, known as the birthplace of South Carolina. Green serves on the steering committee for the International African American Museum and continues to serve on its public programming committee. We're looking forward to that museum opening in 2022. She's a board member of the South Carolina National Heritage Corridor and is a partner with the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission. Rhoda, welcome, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thank you.
Our next featured speaker for tonight is Mr. Herb Fraser. Herb is really a Charlestonian, a former marketing director at Magnolia Plantation and Gardens in Charleston. Before he joined Magnolia, he edited and reported for 5 daily newspapers in the South, including his hometown paper, The Post and Courier. In 1990, as a member of the South Carolina Press Association, he was named Journalist of the Year. He is taught news writing as a visiting lecturer at Rhodes University in South Africa. He's a former Michigan Journalism Fellow at the University of Michigan, and he studied journalism at the University of South Carolina. After leaving daily journalism in 2003, Herb has taught journalism workshops in Sierra Leone, Zambia, Ghana, Suriname, Guyana, and the Gambia for the US government, and is a Washington-based journalism foundation. His international reporting experiences include the fall of the Berlin Wall, humanitarian relief efforts in Bosnia and Rwanda post-genocide. He's also reported on conflict in Sierra Leone. He's written about the historical and cultural ties between West Africa and the Gullah Geechee people of coastal South Carolina and Georgia, i.e. Low Country. He represents South Carolina on the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor Commission, created by the US Congress in 2006. He is the author of Behind God's Back, Gullah Memories, and also co-author of We Are Charleston, Tragedy and Triumph at Mother Emanuel, with Marjorie Wentworth and Dr. Bernard Cowers Jr. He has a forthcoming book out called Crossing the Sea on a Sacred Song, based on an African funeral song that links a woman in Georgia with a woman in Sierra Leone. All I have to say to that is, well, we'll talk a little bit about that, Herb, during tonight's discussion.
Sure.
So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin.
And finally, Heather Hodge serves as Executive Director of the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, which is a federal national heritage area from November 2017 through October 2020. She's placed an emphasis during her tenure on developing educational programs, supporting cultural documentation and historic preservation efforts, encouraging heritage tourism, and fostering new research to facilitate interpretation of Gullah Geechee history and culture. Heather serves on the advisory board for the Charles W. Joyner Institute for Gullah and African Diaspora Studies, and she was recently appointed to the Board of Trustees of the American Folklife Center at the Library of Congress. Heather, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and happy Juneteenth.
Happy Juneteenth, and dare I say, as the Barbadian sitting here, I want to congratulate you and say that we're meeting on a truly auspicious day. We're meeting on the day where Juneteenth has been written into federal law as a national holiday. Absolutely amazing. And as was said by her, clearly this was the plan. They knew it was coming. That's why we're here. We're here to talk about emancipation. We're here to realize that emancipation continues to be a process. And it's a process that has to be continually fed by re-education, continually fed by the connections made through spaces, and the realization that when we speak of emancipation for Juneteenth, we also talk emancipation August 1st in the British Caribbean, of the connection that is across water, that those of us who are descendants of those who were kidnapped and shipped across the Atlantic share in that Atlantic world. And it's in that Atlantic world that we now continue tonight's discussion. For those of you watching, the format for tonight is as follows. Each speaker will speak for 10 minutes, after which we will have our own internal panel discussion. And at the top of the hour, in keeping with the interactive nature of this webinar, looking for you to provide us with questions and answers and comments so that we get a fuller understanding of the road to emancipation and the role played with the Gullah Geechee corridor. Recognizing, of course, that we won't get to cover all of it, but seeing this as the beginning discussion of that journey. And at this time, I would like to turn to Herb as one of the commissioners to just give us a short understanding of what is that Gullah Geechee corridor that spans the 425 miles from South Carolina down to Florida. Herb.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you to the staff of the U.S. Embassy in Barbados for making this opportunity available to us. It's a pleasure to be on this panel with my friends and colleagues, Rhoda Green and Heather Hodges. Before I begin, I would like to also acknowledge that the day, yes, is a momentous day with the federal legislation to create Juneteenth as a national holiday. But I also would like to note that here in Charleston, it's a day of remembrance because 6 years ago, 9 people lost their lives in Emmanuel AME Church when a white supremacist went in and shot them. It's a day to remember those 9 victims, which we call the Emmanuel 9, and also remember the 5 people who survived that tragedy 6 years ago. I grew up in that church, so it brings back a lot of memories of that night. And also, I'm constantly always reminded, since I live here in Charleston, of my childhood in that church. I bring you greetings, too, from the Gullah Geechee corridor and the commission that was created in 2006, a federally mandated commission to oversee the preservation and promotion of Gullah Geechee culture in the corridor that extends, as Kevin mentioned, for over 400 miles from Wilmington, North Carolina to St. Augustine, Florida. And who are Gullah Geechee people? The term Gullah Geechee, we hear that term is used interchangeably. Geechee primarily refers to, or the people in Georgia prefer to be called Geechee. But I'm going to defer that I'm Gullah since I grew up in South Carolina. We prefer that term in this state. But Gullah Geechee people are the ancestors. We are the descendants, rather. We are the descendants of those enslaved Africans who were captured from the west coast of Africa and brought to the southeastern United States. And our ancestors, and I say our because I took a DNA test, and according to my DNA test, I'm Mende from Sierra Leone. And these captured Africans came from the Rice Coast, Senegambia, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, the Gold Coast, and Ghana, as far south along the West African coastline to Angola. And they were brought here, and they mostly resided on what we call barrier islands, or sea islands, that stretch along the corridor, just off. They're not isolated or islands off the coast, but they're islands that are surrounded by rivers and creeks and marshes along this 400-mile corridor. And most of the people came here, a lot of folks came here or brought here because of their technical skills to grow rice. Rice was a cash crop in the 1700s, 1800s. And they lived on these barrier islands, these isolated barrier islands. And on these islands provided the isolation that provided for the melding of different African cultures along with English culture and language to produce what we now know as Gullah Geechee people. The culture is expressed in the language, in religious beliefs, foodways, arts, and crafts. And one of the most visible and endearing and very popular crafts is sweetgrass baskets, coiled baskets. And when you travel to the West, when you travel to Sierra Leone or Senegambia, you see that technology there too. And that's the technology that was brought here. And those, although it's a craft now, it's a decorative item. Those were the tools that were used to clean rice, to store rice. And families held on to this tradition. And it is now a very popular tourist item. When you come to Charleston, for instance, you'll see these sold down in the market area. The culture is also expressed in music, in ring shouts, in gospel music. And a more popular music band, Ranky Tanky, which won a Grammy a few years ago. Many of those members of that band, they're local folks, local musicians who express the culture through their music. Through the arts, a lot of folks are familiar with Jonathan Green and John W. Jones, and Columbia artists, whose vibrant colors and scenes of Gullah people doing what Gullah people did, either working in the fields or fishing or just in the communities. That is one of the things that you'll see in their art. Community initiatives, there are multiple community initiatives throughout the corridor that the commission is involved with in partnering and helping communities express the culture in a number of ways. Just recently, there's an effort made in a community just north of here to create a Gullah museum in an abandoned school in an area, a little small fishing village called McClellanville, north of Charleston. That community wants to preserve the culture there. There's also efforts to organize people and help people help people advocate for the preservation of their land as a consequence of sea level rise. So that's one of the things that the corridor is also involved in addition to helping communities advocate for the preservation of their land when it's threatened by development, because you can well imagine that along the coast, developers have an eye on acquiring this property to turn it into resorts. And a lot of land has already been lost as a result of the encroachment of development. So, and I might add one other thing, that the Gullah Geechee National Heritage Corridor is one of 55 federal heritage areas in the United States. But what makes it so unique is that it's the only heritage area that is solely set aside for the purpose of telling the story of people, not just the landscape, but people. So that's the stage in which we move in here. And I look forward to expanding on that, as well as talking to you about Juneteenth and telling you my stories about Juneteenth as a Gullah man from South Carolina. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Herb, as a Gullah man from South Carolina. And in fact, ending on the note, speaking about that intangible heritage of why the corridor is so unique, allows me an easy segue into speaking to the intangible heritage encapsulated in the connections between Gullah and Barbados. And there's no one better prepared, who better knows that history than Rhoda Green. So Rhoda, welcome and good night.
Thank you so much. It's an honor and a privilege to be working and collaborating and now sharing with Heather and Herb. I find myself in a peculiar place in that I feel as though I have 1 foot in Barbados and 1 foot in Charleston. And I roam, I walk, I interface with people, always with that knowledge or that sense of connecting the Caribbean to Charleston, because the things that bind us are so real and they are obvious. You can't escape them. So here in Charleston, I have learned so much, and it is the type of place that really enfolds you. I'm so enthralled by all of the things that I would have seen in Barbados, and now I see things similarly related in the Charleston area. Against the backdrop of Caribbean Heritage Month and the auspicious thing that occurred with the Juneteenth becoming a national holiday, it brings everything into kind of full focus. And I always think in terms of the connection that is between Barbados, the Caribbean, and this area is so tangible in many ways. Yes, there are a lot of things that influences that are there that someone has to point to them and give some sort of explanation. And the one thing that I realize is that enslaved people from Barbados, they were being brought to the United States early on in the history of the United States. And as we talk about South Carolina or the Carolinas, some of them found they were here. When the colonists from Barbados settled, many of them brought enslaved people from Barbados and from the Caribbean. So even before the influx of people who later became known as the Gullah Geechee people in the 1730s, or in that time period when rice became the crop that replaced sugar in that, well, it was the comparable crop. In Barbados, in the Caribbean, it was sugar, but here it became rice. So we had enslaved people from Barbados and from the Caribbean being brought to the Carolinas as early as 1670. And then the influx of people from West Africa brought directly to work on the rice fields became the Gullah Geechee people. So there's that period between 1670 and the 1700s when people from the Caribbean were the majority Blacks who were here in the Carolinas. And moving forward, it's very important to note that during the Reconstruction period, there were people from the Caribbean who were part of the freedom fighters, as they were called. Eric Forner, in his book, lists a number of people who were the freedom makers, as they were called, but they were West Indians, people from Barbados. We have Crispus, his name was August Strater, David August Strater from Barbados. He was one of the people here. And then we have Robert Elliott from Jamaica. And going through that book, you have people coming from all over the Caribbean, even Dutch Guyana. So the people from the Caribbean were here, and they were involved in the civil struggles that the people of the Gullah Geechee communities were going through, and they were part and parcel of the community. Just recently, 2 days ago, I got an email from a person who called me wanting to know more about the Barbados and Carolina connection. And here's his story, because it is a story that has been told over and over. He said that his grandparents were from Charleston, and his grandmother told him, his surname is Weeks, and his maternal side is Simmons. And what he said is that when he was growing up, his grandmother told him that his people didn't come from Africa; they came from the Barbados. And people just chuckled and thought, well, if they're from Barbados, they came from Africa. Well, that's true. That is so true. But the thing about it is the connection and the role and the place that Barbados and the Caribbean played in the history of the South Carolinians, or in the agricultural South. Pretty much that story has been muted, or it was pretty much put to the background, and people kind of distance themselves from that story. I remember when they were doing town hall meetings for the Gullah Geechee people, as a reporter, they asked me to transcribe a lot of the information that was being exchanged at the town hall meetings. And I remember a lot of people didn't really grasp the connection and the partnership or the joint struggles that the people from Barbados and the other Caribbean islands shared with the Gullah Geechee people. So there was kind of a pushback. But more and more in recent times, there is the awareness that the connection is real, because through family genealogy, a lot of people, as they do their family research, everybody wants to know their roots. More and more, you're having people who are being directed to Barbados, the archives, the Caribbean, to understand where they came from. So that linkage is there. That familial connection, that is there. And in order for people to understand, we have to share that history, and we have to make that link known. Another very important part of that whole connection is because Barbados, Bridgetown, was a major seaport in the Americas. It was the first seaport, and so the information flowed. Charleston became a major seaport, and again, seaports are the places, the hub where a lot of activity, a lot of culture is exchanged, a lot of things go on, and that is part of the connection. And so it is so much, it's everywhere, and it's things that we are delving into so that we can understand and share what we have or what we know in common, because we have a lot in common. Thank you.
Thank you, Rhoda, for that, reminding us of connections and reminding us that there is that shared history. And one of the key things about that shared history is agency, the want to resist, the wish to be free, started at capture. And it didn't end when you came off the slave ship. It didn't end when you found yourself working back-breaking days in the field. That agency, in fact, has led us to this discussion, led to that historic passage in Congress today of recognizing Juneteenth as Emancipation Day, as Black Independence Day. And even that is causing controversy. But it leads us into heaven as to the importance of that Gullah Geechee corridor, both as the story of emancipation and the celebration of Juneteenth. So Heather.
Thank you. I agree. The recognition of Juneteenth as a holiday is an opportunity for us all to publicly and collectively dedicate ourselves to commemorating emancipation as an important milestone in our nation, but it also provides an excellent opportunity to remember that Juneteenth, or June 19th, 1865, was just one point in a long and gradual process of emancipation for enslaved people in the United States. And I agree, for as long as there was a European slave trade to the Americas, to the Caribbean, there was equally vigorous African resistance and often outright rebellion. And in the densely connected Atlantic world, we can't underestimate how deeply all Black people around the North American colonies and the Caribbean basin were united in their desire to abolish slavery, and often took inspiration and found courage from each other. And so visiting the historic and heritage sites in the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor, I think, can help people understand not just the Barbados, Carolinas connection that Rhoda described, but how the Juneteenth celebration fits into this longer and shared history of colonialism, immigration, slavery, revolution, rebellion, and emancipation in the broader constellation of the former Western European colonies in the Atlantic world. Because Gullah Geechee people, as Herb mentioned, lived on the Atlantic coast. So their history and culture is deeply entwined with this shared history across the Atlantic basin of colonial contestation, of chattel slavery, of rebellion, and we haven't talked about it, but cultural creolization. The Gullah language is an English-based Atlantic Creole language. Well, guess what else is? Bajan. Guess what else is? Jamaican patois. So there are a lot of intersections there. And so we encourage people to come to the corridor, not just to learn about the Gullah Geechee people, to learn about very specific connections like Barbados to Carolinas, but also to better understand this entire period. And how we all got to emancipation a little later in our country than in Barbados, where emancipation occurred in 1834. But for centuries, we were united in a common struggle. And I think one of the key reasons to visit the corridor, in addition to familiarizing yourself and learning about the Gullah Geechee people, is it provides all of us with a different timeline for understanding the African experience in the New World. There's been a lot of talk in the United States about the 1619 Project. Well, 1619 refers to the beginning of slavery in the English colonies in the United States, in Jamestown and Virginia, but the African presence in what is now the United States starts in the 16th century. It begins as early as 1565 with the oldest permanent European settlement, which was a Spanish settlement in St. Augustine, Florida. So we're talking about, almost 100 years that need to be accounted for in the African experience in the New World. And a place to start that story is in St. Augustine, in La Florida, which becomes important. La Florida, a Spanish colony. Spanish were contesting control of the lower Atlantic coastline with the English, who had their base, as Rhoda mentioned, in South Carolina, in Charleston, which is established in, correct me if I'm wrong, the 1670s. And so as long as there was the buffer of what became Georgia between the two, there was a certain status quo. But when Georgia is established as a colony by the British in the 1750s, all of a sudden the Spanish are feeling very threatened. So what do? They let it be known that if you were enslaved by the British in Georgia and South Carolina, and you made it to St. Augustine, you would get your freedom, right? So La Florida becomes a destination for Africans, for the ancestors of the Gullah Geechee people, fleeing slavery in the British colonies in the north. They come down south to Florida. And so you can visit Florida, a historic site called Fort Mose, which was established in 1738 by the Spanish colonial government as a settlement for these newly self-liberated Africans from South Carolina and Georgia. You can visit it. You can visit historic sites related to Spanish occupation, but you can also visit this historic settlement site at Fort Mose. Established in 1738, what happens in 1739, for those of you all who are familiar with South Carolina history, the Stonewall Rebellion happens outside of Charleston. the largest Black uprising in what were the British North American colonies. And as those people were revolting, the record is very clear that they were marching and saying they were headed for Florida. So when you think about this arc of self-liberation, of running away, it's very hard to understand that story without understanding this bigger picture of what was happening in the Atlantic world. So sites like Fort Mose, Castillo de San Marcos, and St. Augustine are a good place to begin to understand what this longer history of resistance looks like. Flash forward, we talk about the war for independence in the colonies. Many people unaware of the fact that the Gullah Geechee people weren't bystanders during that conflict. As Rhoda mentioned, when the original settlers came from Barbados, they brought Africans with them. As a matter of fact, people may not realize South Carolina was a majority Black colony and was a majority Black state until after the Civil War. So there were a lot of people of African descent, a lot of ancestors of the Gullah Geechee people here on the Lower Atlantic coastline, and who were not just witnesses to the American Revolution, they were participants in the American Revolution. And some of them used that military service to bargain for their freedom. And it wasn't just the ancestors of the Gullah Geechee people as Black people putting their lives on the line during the American Revolution. There was also a contingent of Haitian soldiers who served with the French, and in fact saw frontline service in Savannah. And if you visit Savannah, Georgia today, you will find a monument to those Haitian soldiers. And during this period of revolution, it wasn't just the American Revolution didn't happen in a vacuum. You had a revolution happening in France. After the American Revolution, you had a revolution where? In Haiti. And Black people in the colonies heard about that. So the Haitians liberate themselves in 1804, I believe. And just a few years later, you have Buss's Rebellion on Barbados. You have in 1822, Denmark Vesey's Rebellion in Charleston, taking direct inspiration from what was happening in Haiti. And so you can visit a marker and monument to Bussa on Barbados. You can also visit a marker and monument to Denmark Vesey, who, to loop back to Herb's speech, was a member of Mother Emanuel AME Church. So this is a church and a congregation that has been at the center of a lot of this history for almost 200 years. And so we encourage people to come and visit, not just the mainland, but the islands. We haven't talked about beyond them being places where Gullah Geechee people were settled. Because of where they were militarily, they were important. So, for example, during the War of 1812, the British occupied for a time Cumberland Island, which is off the coast of Georgia. Well, guess what? There were Gullah Geechee people on Cumberland Island who read the way the winds were blowing, volunteered to serve with the British, saw military service. And when the British pulled out and conceded in the War of 1812, those men and women were relocated to Trinidad. You visit Trinidad today, there are a group of people called the Americans, and Rhoda can talk more about this. The Americans are the direct descendants of these Gullah Geechee men who served in the War of 1812. So there are a lot of very specific historic sites like Cumberland Island, like Mother Emanuel, like Fort Mose that you can visit to better understand the role that the Gullah Geechee people played, not just in their own liberation, but as part of this broader movement towards emancipation and the abolition of slavery in the New World.
Thank you for that, Heather. Actually, that further elaborates on connections and strands. And if you were to go to Trinidad today and go down to Ruga, those American companies, because the villages are still retain the company names in which the men would have served as soldiers, still exist to today. The memory of where they came from still exists to today. It is simply amazing.
And the rice.
And the rice. And the rice. So true. And the rice. So basically, when we're talking about the road to emancipation and using the Gullah Geechee corridor as almost a symbol of that, as you said, we do need to go back to the foundations of Spanish America and the agency created there as a form of resistance and to bring it forward. And it makes me ask the question, in fact, what's a new way of interpreting the corridor? Because we see it rightly so as that place where the intangible and tangible history of Gullah Geechee is to be seen. But there's another component that we're now beginning to delve into, and that is, it is in fact the road to emancipation at a particular point in time. I don't know if we want to take it up there, because I find that extremely fascinating. And to remind people that when we talk about enslaved people in the Atlantic world, let's forget about borders, because information is being shared, gossip is being passed by sailors and washerwomen and across spaces. So people know what's happening with the Haitian Revolution in 1804. There are planned rebellions in the Atlantic world and the Caribbean because of the Haitian Revolution. There is increased surveillance and oppression by colonial powers because of the Haitian Revolution. So sorry, let me just drop and delve into that. And what are the other ways in which we can take a look at the Gullah Geechee corridor as that corridor of emancipation?
Well, I think I'd actually pass the mic to my colleague, Herb Frazier, because he worked at one of these historic sites that went through this process of, and is still going through the process of trying to figure out how we interpret and share this history in 2021.
Yep, Magnolia.
Well, thank you, Heather. Thank you, Kevin. I found myself in a rather unusual situation when I joined the staff at Magnolia in 2010. And I think my experiences as a journalist, having covered much of what we're talking about from West Africa, from Barbados and Cuba, because after all, when Florida ceded, when the Spanish ceded Florida to the English, people there who had come to Florida, who fled to Florida, they left Florida and went to Cuba. So you'll find elements of Gullah culture in the communities east of Havana, as well as Barbados. But to get back to your point, Heather, having done much of this as a journalist, I found myself prepared to write about the African influences and at Magnolia, because I'd written about it. But as a Black man, it was kind of interesting to find myself in a position where it was my job to sell Magnolia to the public. But when you look at it, when I looked at it and internalized it, I said, what a wonderful opportunity to use the resources and the reputation of Magnolia to amplify the role that people of African descent made, not just on South Carolina and Low Country, South Carolina and Charleston, but to develop a world-class garden, because they were the hands in the soil who planted the camellias and the azaleas. And before that, they were the hands in the soil who cut those dikes to produce the rice fields. Because Magnolia did grow some rice before 1840, before the property was transitioned over into a garden, which it is today. It's the oldest public garden in the United States. But the centerpiece of it all is three or four, I'm sorry, I can't remember, it's been a while, 3 or 4 cabins, wooden cabins, dwelling places where enslaved people lived, built in 1850. And those are the focal points for an ongoing daily interpretation of the African American presence at Magnolia. And each of these cabins have been redesigned to express different periods of time before and after emancipation up until the civil rights movement of the 1960s. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that my friend and colleague, Joe McGill, is one of the interpreters there on a daily basis who shares with the guests the experiences of African Americans. Now, he's not the only. There's Rick. There's others. That there might be some more that I've not met since I left Magnolia, but it's an ongoing daily tour. So you come there, you can get an up close, personal discussion, not just about the influences there at Magnolia, but also you can talk about how slavery has shaped, the institution of slavery has shaped the economy of the South, was necessary to support the economy of the South, and how it has influenced us after emancipation and continues to be a vital topic of conversation, as evidenced as to what's going on today with Juneteenth. We're continuing to talk about this, and it's a subject that is so pervasive in our culture that it makes a lot of people uncomfortable, really. Magnolia offers this tour, has been offering this tour since about 2009, I believe. But it is not the most popular tour. People would rather see the gardens, they'd rather see the big house, or they would rather see alligators on the nature tour. But Magnolia persists because it is a topic that we must present to the public in order for us to have an greater understanding of the role that slavery played in this culture and continues to play in this culture, and it's important truth-telling that has to happen in order for a healing to take place.
Now we talk about healing and telling truth. So how important is it then that the educational system needs to be up to date and current and honest about the telling of that history?
How much time you asking me that question, and how much time do we have? Look,
we don't have a lot of time.
Well,
but
I'll make it short. I'll make it real short, because I'm a product of the educational system in South Carolina. I went to segregated schools in Charleston. It wasn't until 1965, the spring of 65, when my father was transferred to a naval base outside of the United States, that I went to school with white kids. So I got that lesson, that history lesson, from first grade to ninth grade or eighth grade, I can't remember which. And slavery was not a part of it. And certainly Juneteenth was not a part of it. I did not learn of Juneteenth until the summer of 1982, when I was doing a journalism workshop fellowship at the University of Arizona. And someone mentioned to me in Tucson, they said, what are you doing this weekend? I said, not much. He said, well, you want to go down to the Juneteenth celebration? This is 1982, the hottest summer of my life in Tucson, Arizona. And I said, what is Juneteenth? And that started that process for me to become educated and aware of what Juneteenth was. Fast forward, I come back home east of the Mississippi, and I come home, I ask my friends, y'all ever heard of Juneteenth? No, this is no one's heard of Juneteenth. Mm-hmm. And within the decades since, it has accelerated and rapidly become what it is today. So this was not the history we were taught. I was taught. I didn't know black or white kids were taught in a segregated school system in South Carolina. And even after then, I'm sure that they did not get that detailed into the history, because like I said, at Magnolia, folks don't necessarily want to come and hear this talk about slavery. Now, some do, but a lot of folks don't want to hear this talk about slavery because it is a painful subject for people for a variety of reasons, blacks and whites.
Yeah, but it's a subject, I dare say, that needs to be told.
Yes.
There are ways around speaking about traumatic history. And I think that for me, the other thing about the Gullah Geechee corridor is the celebration of the survival and what was created in terms of creating creolized cultures in order to deal with that trauma is also what should be celebrated. I'm almost tempted to ask Rhoda, because I'm sure Rhoda would have gone to school in Barbados at a time where we only learned about British history. I luckily, because of, I'm going to say my tender years, went to school in a situation where our curriculum became more West Indianized, and we learned about that difficult history. But to the point where now we're still understanding it, we're still coming to grips with it, but it's no longer hidden. And for me, that's perhaps one of the ways in which we can have that discussion with our American brothers and sisters. And likewise, how we can also learn from you, because I realized that from Magnolia, you stopped doing weddings at the plantation.
No, they didn't. No,
They
still
didn't.
do weddings.
They
Yeah.
still do weddings, but they're doing
yeah.
one or two where they're moving away from doing weddings.
I don't think the
No?
I don't think I don't think anyone have gone shied away from that.
Okay.
I think they all still do weddings because it's a very profitable business, and people still want to have them there. I think that we approach it by reminding people, even in the marketing, that what the history was. It's not something you hide.
No.
It's something you put out there, and you say this is what happened. But we're trying to reinterpret, as we said, reinterpret this history to put the emphasis on the people, the enslaved people whose labor, free labor, went into the building of what you see here. Yeah.
And I think that the only plantation site that has stopped weddings is McLeod, and we should mention
McLeod. Okay. I didn't know that.
McLeod, which is operated by Charleston County, is the only plantation site that interprets the history of that site from the perspective of the enslaved. So definitely, if you are planning a trip to the Charleston area and want to visit a plantation, McLeod Plantation on James Island is predicated on centering that history. To Herb's point, some of the other plantations, the story of the enslaved, it's a separate tour you have to buy that people don't always buy. At McLeod, that's all you get. So we encourage people to visit. They're doing, Sean Halifax and his team doing great work at McLeod to try and center that Gullah Geechee story all the way through Reconstruction.
Yeah.
Kevin, you had you asked a question about what you taught in school. I grew up, went to the Modern High, and I knew in order to graduate, or when you graduate, you had to take your school leaving exams and get your LCC, or you get Oxford and Cambridge exam, and it was all about the Stewarts and the Tudors, and we knew all of that. You come to the period where we are now, and particularly coming to South Carolina, colonial history was so important. As a matter of fact, Charleston, South Carolina, that's their identity. The fact that history, colonial history, was so defining for who they are, and that resonates around everything. And in order to even understand the Gullah Geechee story, or to even put it in a context where you understand, you've got to focus on the colonial history, because without the colonial history, there would be no Gullah Geechee history. So we have to be able to see and to synthesize and understand that holistic approach of understanding history. Because one of the things that I have noted, a lot of Gullah Geechee people didn't like to go to the plantations, because it was a reminder of a horrendous period. But coming from Barbados, and I guess we are a little bit we are like a generation removed from that raw, harsh history that our Gullah Geechee brothers and sisters in the South have to endure, because it was only in the 1960s that they were still sitting at the back of the bus and that kind of thing. One of the things that I have learned is that when you enter the plantation, it can be a catharsis. It can be an opportunity to pretty much enter not as a victim, but as a conqueror, and see it and claim the space where your ancestors worked, sweat, planned for escapes, and dreamed of a emancipation. So I think it could be a healing place for Gullah Geechee people. When you go there, you don't own the real estate, you don't own the plantation, you don't own but you sure, your ancestors sure occupied that space. And you should claim that. You should represent them by reclaiming what was lost.
Yep.
Your freedom, all of the things that were lost. It's an opportunity of reclaiming and becoming, I guess, in charge of your fate, so to speak. So throughout all of the plantations, they're telling the story and whatever. Again, the problem is that, it's a money-making affair.
Well, let me add something quick, Rhoda. What you're talking about is the Bowens story at Drayton
Yes.
Hall. And you brought Richmond Bowen back to St. Lucie in Barbados several years ago. And it's also the story of the Bennett family at Magnolia. These
That's
two
right.
families, they're not the only ones, but these are the two that come to mind that we can talk about in the limited time we have, that do exactly what you are talking about. They claim this space because it was their ancestors who made those spaces what they are today.
Yeah, and let's also not forget that history gets passed down within Gullah Geechee communities itself. People aren't wholly reliant on schools or visit to historic sites like plantations to know that history. The Gullah Geechee people keep their own memories of this history. And so, Herb mentioned earlier not being familiar with Juneteenth celebrations. Well, that's because Juneteenth emanates from Texas and the experience of African Americans in Texas, and the fact that some people weren't aware that they were free until 1865. But that's an experience that happens much earlier for Gullah Geechee people in South Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina because of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation, in which you start to see, when it goes into the effect, the liberation of people in those states that are in open rebellion, and also coincidentally where the Union Army happens to be. So as early as 1863, Gullah Geechee people know emancipation. Gullah Geechee men start serving in the U.S. Civil War. So it wasn't wholly about Lincoln freeing the slaves. Almost 250,000 African-American men served the United States colored troops, many of them Gullah Geechee men who saw action in South Carolina, in Georgia, and in Florida. And after emancipation, Gullah Geechee people keep that memory and history alive with their watch night and Emancipation Proclamation celebrations. So to this day, on December 31st, Gullah Geechee people go to church and have a vigil service. And part of what happens during that service is a commemoration of what their ancestors were thinking, feeling, and experiencing on December 31st, 1862. So they kept that memory alive. And it broadens out from the community. If you look at Memorial Day, what are the origins of Memorial Day? They're here in Charleston, South Carolina, which has, should add, the oldest continuous Emancipation Proclamation Day parade in the entire country, right? They've done it continuously since 1865. So that whole period during Reconstruction, where the South is rebuilding, trying to figure out a path forward, one of the very specific contributions of the Gullah Geechee people is to continuously remind the community and the descendants of that sacrifice, to continuously shine a light on what the Union Army did here, because believe me, South Carolina, if y'all don't know, still has a Confederate Memorial Day. That became the dominant narrative that Herb heard about in school. Well, the Gullah Geechee people had a counter narrative, and they kept it alive, and they still tell those stories until 2021. So when we think about history, let's not forget the contributions of those individual Gullah Geechee men and women sharing these stories with their children, sharing these stories with these congregations, celebrating emancipation on watch night, contributing to what became Memorial Day, and parading through downtown Charleston every year on January 1st to remind people of their sacrifice and the ways in which they contributed to their own emancipation and liberation.
So agency and resilience is to be found within the Gullah Geechee corridor.
Yes.
And it's very important, as you said, the memory. Rhoda kind of mentioned it when she spoke to that gentleman who spoke about his grandmother passing on that oral history of the Weeks and Simmons and the fact that they came from Barbados. We've got to continue to privilege the oral history narrative as one of the other forms of agency in the road to emancipation. And whether it is memory that is passed down or it is memory that manifests itself in what you just described happening on the 31st of December, where people have the watch night celebration, and it has continued, counter to a narrative that will seek to deny its existence. If we turn quickly to our online audience, and thank you so much for joining in with us. It almost feels as though we're not going to have enough time, but we're going to make time. What is it? Making somewhere out of nowhere. And we're going to do that. The question was asked, do we know how many Barbadians, enslaved Barbadians, came from Barbados to the Carolinas? And from what countries in Africa?
Well, I can speak on the countries in Africa. It's from Senegal down to Angola, primarily the rice coast of Senegambia, Guinea, Sierra Leone, and northern Liberia. And it's primarily because of what we said earlier, because of rice cultivation. It's one of the things that we point out, that people weren't wanted or prized for their physical skills, but their technical knowledge. As far as how many people came from Barbados, I don't know. I don't know if anyone's ever counted that.
Herb, what we have learned from the historical documentation is that at that early period, the majority of Blacks or people of African descent who were in the Carolinas, because they were brought from Barbados, and we must not forget that they were brought from other Caribbean islands too, but they call all of them Barbadians because Barbados was the hub, the British hub of expansion. But at that early period, the Black population outnumbered at a certain point the white population.
Sure.
Because the workforce was needed to help clear the land and prepare the plantations for whatever crop. So at that early period, there were more people from the Caribbean. Some of them would have been people who came from West Africa, came to Barbados, but there were also some who were born in Barbados at the time. So you had that movement of people, creolized already, seasoned, as they call them. So that influence was dominant. And I've read where a lot of the newcomers, those coming from West Africa, the people who were seasoned, the people who knew the ropes and who were able to guide and steer the newcomers were people from the Caribbean, people from Barbados. So if you look at it based on the ratio rather than the numbers, because the population was so little, as compared to what we have. But the ratio was tremendous.
Okay, thanks for that, Rhoda. But I mean that's also in terms of when you say ratio to let's say black to white, enslaved to free. There's always going to be a larger proportion of people who are enslaved than those who were free. But what's important in what you said was that remembrance and that understanding of bringing already skilled enslaved people from the Caribbean, Barbados, to Charleston. Some of them who, by the time you are looking at bringing enslaved people directly from Western Africa to work in the rice plantations, are perhaps leaders of particular gangs. They're already the skilled artisans and some of the more skilled enslaved people on the plantation who then apprentice persons coming in, and in a way acculturate, but also in that melding, begin to recreate in some instances those African linguistic traditions, cultural traditions, and that a lot of that really comes out in the food. And food as resistance is something that you really got to talk about. I remember the first time, I've never had the privilege of going to Charleston, but the first time I was introduced in DC to what was traditional rice meal in Charleston, I smiled because it was Hoppin' John. Hoppin' John is what my grandmother cooked on a Sunday. It was immediately familiar. And they were like, wait a minute, I know what that is. And for colleagues who've gone down, from hearing Gullah for the first time and being able to respond, because this was not a foreign language at all. Even though Barbadians talk about we have a dialect and it isn't a patois, which is its own language like Jamaica, once you heard Gullah, it was immediately recognizable. So it's the cultural resistance that for me forms a pivotal part of that road to emancipation, is that continued agency of passing meals and the way in which meals are used to create kinship, and the way how meals help in the spread of resistance as well. It becomes an important thing when we talk about that Gullah Geechee corridor. Some of the comments online, persons are thanking you for your presentations. Some want to know what are some of the Bajan surnames still prevalent in South Carolina that come from Barbados. I'll let Rhoda take that. And also someone said that my grandfather fixed porridge from St. Michael in Barbados, which is really interesting. But I'll go to family names. Very, very quickly, Rhoda, if you can just talk about that a little bit.
One of the things that people say, if you were to go to Barbados and you open the phone book, you will see all of the names that are, so many of the names that are common to South Carolina. Mm-hmm. So you can go down and call a host of them. Simmons, we mentioned that. You have, you have Middleton, Drayton. You have some of the common ones. A host of them. I would have to get my phone book to be able to look and tell you. But I guarantee you, I look in the phone books or in the obituaries each day in the Charleston obituaries, and the names are so Barbadian, right? You know, there is a Bennett. There is you name them, those names are there. What is the connection? Many of them were derived from their colonial British slave owners, owned the plantations, and some of them inherited the names, took the names. But there's just even Irish names, because Barbados had a great influx of indentured servants from Ireland. So you have that name though that names, Irish Scottish names, there is a lot of the more modern names, or some of the older names that probably we don't see them in Barbados anymore. But gosh, I have there's a book written about the people who came from Barbados. This is just one
nice.
exhibit.
Oh my God.
So we Bailey, Baldwin, Ball, Barnes, Brathwaite, Belgrave, Beresford, Beringer, Archer, Ashford. These are names of people who came from Barbados. Brown, Briggs, Brooks, Elliott, Codrington, Cole, Cooper. Should I stop or should I keep going?
No, just stop for now.
Okay,
I think that really helps us. In fact, it leads into the second question. What's the history of the naming practice in South Carolina? And my reason for asking that is in Barbados, work done by Professor Pedro Welts and Professor Jerome Handler in looking at the surnames taken by the newly freed after emancipation. It's not them taking the names of the slave owner, is that they took the surnames of people who they respected. And it isn't directly tied to the person who owned the plantation on which they lived on. So I want to find out, do you find that same naming practice happening in South Carolina?
Yes, very much so. As you were speaking, I was thinking from the Magnolia point of view. I don't know of a Drayton Black family that took their name from the Draytons. There probably is one, but I will. And someone asked, could we talk about Middleton? And one of the things that Middleton Place, which is just north of Magnolia on the Ashley River, but one of the things that Middleton Place has done consistently over the decades is that they brought the white Middletons together with the Black Middletons, bringing these two families together for very intimate conversations. And that is very interesting. It has led to some very interesting relationships and discoveries, and you can imagine what emanated out of that. And when I worked at the paper, one of the last assignments I had before I left the paper was to cover one of those Black Middleton, White Middleton reunions. And I interviewed some people who came down to South Carolina from New York, and they were coming down, and they were really, really looking forward to that experience. So that goes back to the fact that you're saying there are some people who embrace this history because of these family connections, because they recognize that it was their ancestors who made these places possible.
That is extremely powerful. Ricardo Bentham has a very important question. How can we memorialize the unknown dead slaves in Charleston? He asked something like the Tomb of the Unknown for our Barbadian Gullah slaves that died but were never buried or memorialized. That's a very important question, Ricardo. I'll ask everyone to weigh in on that.
I think that, were you going to say something, Herb?
No, go ahead.
I think that's a fantastic idea, particularly in downtown Charleston. We have many people who come to visit historic Charleston, and if they are African American of African descent, they always remark upon the fact that there is almost no discussion about the lives of the people that were enslaved either in the old walled city or what became historic Charleston. There's not a lot of discussion of either urban slavery or the fact that what is it consists of the built heritage of historic Charleston, all these beautiful buildings you see. Well, the money and the labor that contributed to them was Gullah Geechee and was African. So it can be very difficult for people to see that history. And so with the International African American Museum coming online, that solves part of that problem because now you have a very visible landmark that shares that history. But this question of, memorializing people, particularly at particular sites where they might have lived, is a challenge. Herb mentioned Joe McGill with the Slave Dwelling Project. Well, one of the things he does in urban areas like Charleston is to highlight and point out those spaces where enslaved people lived and died. And his project is to take people to spend the night in those places, to call attention to them, to point out when they can and should be preserved and perhaps become memorials. A lot of that work has to be done. And they're all projects. I'll drop a link in the comments after the program, where people are starting to take this work on. So for example, in downtown Charleston, we have a large performing arts venue called the Gullah Arts Center. When excavation was being done for the Gullah Arts Center, they found the remains of enslaved Africans there. And those bodies were removed and had to be reinterred and memorialized. And that project was taken on by the Gullah Society here in Charleston, which focuses on the preservation of Gullah cemeteries and raising awareness about them. But they went through a long process that involved a lot of community consultation about what's the correct way to show honor to these ancestors and to reinter them. And I think they came up with a very beautiful solution. And where that project stands now is I believe that they are working with the city to think about what a permanent memorial would look like. So I agree that Charleston in particular, given we haven't talked about it, we haven't mentioned it, the sheer number of that came through the port of Charleston and stayed here and were enslaved, but were then also transported to other plantations. I think the number is, Herb and Rhoda can correct me, almost 40% of all the Africans that were brought into this country came through Charleston and the Gullah Geechee Cultural Heritage Corridor. So Charleston is starting to reconcile with that history. The museum will share that history, but then also at the individual site and community level, there are people doing really good work to call attention to the people who lived and died in Charleston, as well as out at Sullivan's Island, which was where people were quarantined. Clearly, a lot of people died out there as well.
I would like to add that a lot of attention is now being paid to cemeteries where people, died, and it was forgotten that was a burial site. And there was one descendant, Philip Simmons, who was iconic in South Carolina, whose ancestors came from Barbados. His grandson, Dr. O, was really spearheading a lot of that work and research of reclaiming cemeteries and making sure that they were restored. Sadly, Dr. O passed about a year or so ago, but he was one of the movers and shakers in that regard, making sure that all of these cemeteries that were overgrown or sometimes forgotten, or developers came and dug up the bodies and built structures on them, putting the spotlight on those. What is interesting about that is that Dr. O, he knew that his great granduncle came from Barbados, because that was part of the story. And he came from Barbados in the early settlement of the Carolinas. So that is how connected.
Yep.
Now, speaking of Dr. O, I'll make it quick. Speaking of Dr. O, in recent years, Dr. O, along with other folks in the Black community in Charleston, organized an event that was begun 20 years previous by Osei Chandler. It was a Remembrance Day celebration on Sullivan's Island.
Yeah.
It was Sullivan's Island, as Heather mentioned, where enslaved people were held, not just enslaved people, all people coming into the port of Charleston on ships were held in a quarantine station just to make sure that they didn't have any contagious diseases. One thing to note, however, it was the people of African descent who were held the least amount of time, because they wanted to shuttle them through so they could get to the auction blocks downtown. Nevertheless, this observance for the past, I think, 20 years or so, they hold it on Sullivan's Island. I don't think they did it in person this year. It was a virtual event, but I believe. But they come to the water's edge. Sullivan's Island is on the Atlantic coast. You have a program, it's a National Park Service site at Fort Johnson, which is just across the waterway from Fort Sumter. You have a program inside. Everyone goes down. There's a drumming procession. You go down to the water. You put some put some flowers in the water. Put your feet in the water. You come back. You have some fruit and flowers and other tokens of remembrance to the ancestors, and that's placed in the water on the other side of the island where the pest houses were believed to have been constructed. They're all physically gone now, but that was one that is continuing to be one of the annual celebrations to those Africans who died during the Middle Passage. And this is a celebration that is timed with other celebrations at ports in the Atlantic world. And I think they do it exactly at noon on the East Coast. And this is in the Caribbean. I think that goes down even to Brazil, and they do similar ceremonies in Brazil, I believe. So, yeah. So there's no physical structure, but there's ongoing remembrance in a variety of ways to the ancestors.
And I would just add to what Herb said. Obia Channel, his ancestors came from Barbados also. So human connections that we can identify today.
Agreed. Because I know we're soon coming to time, but you can't talk about emancipation and resistance without having that discussion about the retention of African spirituality. Mm-hmm. What are the vestiges of those in South Carolina? In the Caribbean, we talk about Obia, which is really a colonial term used to describe religious practice that they don't understand. And it manifests itself in different ways. How does it manifest itself in the Carolinas, and where can we find vestiges of that along the corridor?
Well, you can find some of that in the comments, because I see our Georgia Commissioner Griffin Lotson has been enthusiastically commenting. So Mr. Lotson, Commissioner Lotson, is from coastal Georgia, Darien, Georgia, Brunswick, Georgia. And one of the things that he does is help to preserve and interpret the Gullah Geechee ring shout tradition, which has analogs in parts of the Caribbean and in Brazil. And what this is a cultural expression that can happen during a worship service or a meeting, where the congregation will form a counterclockwise circle. It's a very unusual cultural expression. It really only exists now in regular practice in coastal Georgia, but that is one of the most visible and tangible places where you can see very specific African cultural retention. And his group is the Geechee Gullah Ring Shouters. There's another famous group that you all may have heard of, which is the McIntosh County Shouters out of Bowdoin, Georgia. But there are many aspects of the ring shout and of those traditional services that are still marked and stamped by the spiritual practices of the Africans who were enslaved there.
Thanks for that, because I think that's again, we talk about the intangibleness as agency and resistance. So it's really important that we talk about that as well. And I'm glad to hear of that practice, the ring shout. What comes to mind, not having seen it, is what is called Shouter Baptist in Trinidad, and then what is called Spiritual Baptist in Barbados, and those who then practice Orisha and other African traditional practices. So that's very interesting. Yeah, someone did mention voodoo, the ring shout in the comments. But
well, here in Charleston, we don't call it voodoo.
Call it
root. They just call it root. Root. Yeah, call it root.
Okay,
my grandmother we had a neighbor growing up in the projects my grandmother didn't like her, and my grandmama say, "That woman there, she do root."
Now that's interesting. That's interesting. She do
Yeah,
root. I will remember
yeah,
that.
she do root.
She do root.
Whether
Okay.
she did or not, I don't know, but my grandmother slandered her all the time as a
Yep.
root worker. Yeah,
Oh yeah.
yeah.
Someone asked, is Obia a religion? What I will say is that Obia is that colonial name given to religious practices that the Europeans didn't know, but sought to frame it under a term which was used to demonize, stigmatize, oppress, and try to stamp out those traditional African religious practices. And when you look at the law books in the English-speaking Caribbean, you will see references to Obia and persons being jailed, fined. You have the new missionary of the Christian church, no pun intended, trying to root out Obia, trying to stamp it out. Griffin notes root worker and root doctor. Yes. Now, for me, root doctor, I translate as that traditional medicine person who uses the different herbs and roots and flowers and leaves to create particular emulsions to make people better. So yeah, but that's something else to be discussed. That'll be fine within the corridor. As we're coming almost to time, I really want to thank my featured speakers and you, the audience at home in the diaspora, for joining us. But to say that today we've had the opportunity to explore and have a better understanding of what is the Gullah Geechee corridor and its importance as we discuss emancipation, and dare I say emancipation and resistance on the road to freedom. I'm literally going to give everyone a minute to wrap up if you want to have parting comments based on what we've discussed today. I'll start with Heva, go to Rhoda, and finish with Herb.
Thank you. I've been following the comments, and I'm so excited by the number of people who shared that this was new history for them, because that is the project. That is, I think should be a point of focus and should be a renewed point of focus now that we have the Juneteenth holiday, is to try and have more frequently and more often these sort of in-depth conversations that are internationalized in a way that reflects the fact that this isn't just our story. We share a story with Black brothers and sisters across what they call the New World, across the Caribbean, down into Brazil and Colombia and Venezuela. We have a shared history. And we need to do a better job of making these connections. We need more people like Mrs. Rhoda Green to say, pay attention, right? There are important connections here that help you understand your story, that help you understand your history. So I'm so excited that everyone joined us tonight, and I hope you carry this history forward. I hope you take inspiration from what Rhoda is doing, from what Herb is doing, from what Kevin is doing, and sharing this history broadly and widely, because we have not, I think, done enough to think about and talk about how deeply connected we all are. And not just this in terms of our history and the struggles we shared, but in our victories, and to celebrate them together. And so as we think about celebrating Juneteenth, we also, maybe when we visit Barbados, we plan to go on August 1st. So we celebrate emancipation with them. We plan to visit Buss's statue. We know about Denmark Vesey in South Carolina. We need to know about Buss's rebellion on Barbados. We need to know about Tacky's rebellion on Jamaica. These are our brothers and sisters. This is our history. And so I'm so thrilled that we had the opportunity to open this conversation, and I look forward to seeing it continue.
Thank you, Heather. Rhoda.
It has been indeed a privilege and an honor to be able to share with so many. One of the things that I want us to focus on is that the exchange of people back and forth. We didn't touch on the native people who were brought and enslaved on Barbados from America. That is a component that is very vital to the story. But we have so many other aspects of the cross-pollination, or the movement to and the movement from. We have stories of people who actually shared the commonality of the enslaved experience, the struggles. So the more we are able to look into those connections, the richer we are. I think it is a matter of becoming whole. The more information we have, we become more informed. I think it's liberating too, because once you know the forces that bind you, or the forces that kept your ancestors bound and hindered them, we are able to make adjustments. So this opportunity to understand the holistic story and the vital role that the Caribbean played as the hub, Barbados, into what has become the Americas, I think it opens up the door for a lot of communication, for sharing of history, because when we understand each other's history, we better understand ourselves.
Yes.
That is our responsibility today, because we have a generation that is coming and they're going to be having some challenges, but there's nothing like knowing your history and being informed so that you can make the types of adjustments and the type of movement for I guess for the actualization as people, free people. So thanks again, and stay tuned. You can visit Barbados and the Carolinas Legacy Foundation website by the same name, and you can visit our website, because we tease stories, little bits of history, snippets, as we weave that story together. So thank you in cyber land, and we look forward to continuing this sort of conversation going forward.
All right. Thank you, Rhoda, so much. Herb,
Yes.
last words with you.
Okay, just briefly, again, like my colleague said, thank you for this wonderful opportunity to share this culture with a very wide audience, and particularly an audience who may not have heard about Gullah Geechee, or may have heard about it but did not know that much. And hopefully you've been enlightened and educated, and your knowledge base has been expanded, and now you have an opportunity to maybe do some more exploration on your own. One of the questions that's always asked often is, how is the language and how is the culture changing? And is it under threat? Of course, we know it is under threat, as I mentioned before, because of development. It's under threat. It's also under threat because people are moving away as a result of development. It's under threat because families are losing their property because as a result of heirs property disputes. And we didn't get into that in detail, but it's a rather complicated and sad story. But the preservation of the land is important to the preservation of the culture. One of the good uplifting things that I've seen, that I'm continuing to see, is the fact that young people are embracing the culture. I mentioned Ranky Tanky and the Gullah music. And if you've been watching, I think it's Netflix, Benjamin Dennis, BJ Dennis, the cook, the chef. I mean, he is the man when it comes to Gullah. Well, he's not the only one, but he is one of the many chefs who are really telling the story of Gullah Geechee people through foodways. And check out High on the Hog. I think it's on Netflix. Is that correct? Netflix, yeah.
It is.
I mean, and let me tell you, when I met Jessica B. Harris, when we had her down to Charleston several years ago when her book came out, and Magnolia hosted her at a book talk at the College of Charleston, and she is one of the most down-to-earth sisters you'd ever want to meet. But watching High on the Hog as a person from Charleston, really, my chest was sticking out. There's BJ talking about the food and just listening to his accent, his low country accent, and his mannerisms, and the stories that he tells about his family and the way they prepared food. That did a lot for me, but I'm sure it did a lot for people around the country who was not familiar with the culture. And there are many stories, and many young people like BJ and Charlton Singleton who are telling the stories through their various art forms. So come down. I mean, COVID is kind of going away. Hopefully, come down when you feel comfortable. And there's so many things to explore in the corridor, and there's so many things to explore in Charleston. And let's continue the conversation, as Rhoda said. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Herb. I want to thank you all for joining us today on what has been an amazing panel discussion. Thank you so much for sharing not only your knowledge, but that passion and making those connections for us throughout the diaspora. On behalf of the U.S. Embassy, I want to thank them, and I want to remind those of you listening in that the last presentation of this event will take place on June 24 at noon. The featured speaker will be the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Sir Hilary Beckles, in conversation with Dr. D. Zizwi Po of Lincoln University. I want to thank you all for being here tonight, understanding better the road to emancipation and the role of the Gullah Geechee corridor in telling that story. Good night, everyone. Blessings, and keep safe.